The filtration membrane over the capital city turned brown on a Tuesday, and I knew we were going to die. I remember standing on the observation terrace of the council spire, watching the color change ripple outward across the sky like ink dropped into water. Our atmospheric filtration layer, the living membrane that had protected Shurith Prime for 11,000 years, was decomposing in front of my eyes. The stellar flare that struck us 9 days earlier had done more damage than any of our scientists had predicted. The membrane was not healing. It was rotting. My name is Kaylani Shurith, and I serve as Elder Chronicler of the Velhari people. It is my duty to record everything, every triumph, every loss, every quiet moment between. I have spent my entire life believing that the Chronicle would outlast us all, that future generations would read my words and understand where they came from. Standing on that terrace, watching our sky die, I realized for the first time that there might not be future generations. There might not be anyone left to read a single word I had ever written. The numbers came in that evening. Our lead atmospheric scientist, a woman named Petha Lorinen, delivered the report to the full council, with her bioluminescence almost completely dark, which among my people means grief beyond language. The filtration membrane was degrading at an accelerating rate. Crop failures would begin within 60 days. Water acidification within 90. Total atmospheric collapse within 11 months. 900 million Velhari on a world that was turning against them, and no way to stop it. The council chamber was silent for a long time after Petha finished. We are a quiet people by nature, small in stature, barely a meter tall, with translucent skin that glows in patterns of light to express what words cannot. We are archivists, scholars, weavers of bioluminescent tapestries that can store information in color and light for centuries. We are not warriors. We have no fleet. We have no weapons beyond a small planetary defense grid that could barely stop an asteroid, let alone an invasion. In the Grand Index of Galactic Civilization, the Velhari are classified as a Category 9 species, which is a polite way of saying we do not matter. But we are not stupid, and we are not proud enough to die in silence. The council gave me my orders that night. As Elder Chronicler, I held the diplomatic records of every species we had ever contacted. I knew their protocols, their cultural sensitivities, their preferred forms of address. I was to draft formal distress appeals to every sovereign power in the galactic community and transmit them on priority channels. 41 species, 41 governments, 41 chances to survive. I did not sleep for 3 days. I wrote each appeal by hand, tailoring every word to the recipient. For the Draelith hegemony, I emphasized strategic stability, because the Draelith value order above all else, and a dying world, creates refugee flows that disrupt order. For the Korvathi trade union, I framed our survival as an investment opportunity, because the Korvathi do not understand any language that does not involve profit margins. For the Sethrani collective, I appealed to their ancient philosophical traditions of cosmic stewardship, quoting their own founding texts back to them. For the Concord Assembly, the galactic peacekeeping body that was supposed to exist precisely for moments like this, I simply stated the facts and requested emergency intervention under Article 17 of the Mutual Survival Compact, which every member species had signed. I transmitted all 41 appeals on a single evening, then sat in the communications chamber and stared at the receivers. I told myself that help would come. The galaxy was vast and old, but it was not heartless. Surely, when a species was dying and asked for help, someone would answer. The first response arrived 6 days later from the Draelith hegemony. It was a single line, generated by an automated system. Request logged, resource allocation not authorized at this time. I read it 4 times, certain I was misunderstanding the translation. I was not. The Korvathi response came 2 days after that. It was longer, which gave me a moment of hope before I actually read it. They had conducted a full cost-benefit analysis of potential intervention on Shurith Prime, complete with projected expenditures, resource deployment estimates, and anticipated return on investment. The conclusion was a single sentence at the bottom of 14 pages of calculations. Net benefit analysis negative. Engagement not recommended. The Sethrani collective never responded at all. The Concord Assembly sent a liaison officer, A tall Mithrani bureaucrat who arrived on a pristine shuttle, toured our dying capital with an expression of practiced concern, and informed us that our request for emergency intervention had been received and would be reviewed by the appropriate committee. He estimated 6 to 8 months for a preliminary assessment. When Councillor Vetha Soren pointed out that we would be dead in 11 months, the liaison officer nodded sympathetically and suggested we submit supplementary documentation to expedite the process. One by one, the responses trickled in over the following weeks. Rejections, deferrals, automated replies, silence. A few species expressed what they called deep concern, which is a phrase that sounds like compassion, but functions as a door closing. The Mithrani offered to send an observational team to document our decline for scientific purposes. The Jorath Imperium suggested we consider voluntary relocation, though they did not offer a destination. I kept a record of every response. That is my function. I chronicle. And what I was chronicling was the exact moment an entire galaxy decided that 900 million lives were not worth the trouble. By the 7th week, something had changed inside the council chamber. The fear was still there, but it had calcified into something heavier. Acceptance. I could see it in the dimming bioluminescence of our leaders, in the way they stopped checking the communication channels each morning, in the way Councillor Vetha Soren began quietly approving proposals for cultural preservation vaults, underground archives designed to survive our extinction so that someday someone might find them and know that we had existed. I was in the archive that evening, cataloging what I believed would be the final chronicle entries of the Velhari species, when the communication alert sounded. I almost did not check it. I had trained myself to expect nothing, because nothing was what the galaxy had consistently delivered. But the alert was flagged with an origin code I did not recognize, from a sector on the far spiral arm that the Velhari had almost no contact with. I opened the message. It was short, absurdly short, compared to the elaborate diplomatic correspondence I had spent my life studying. We received your distress call. Fleet is already en route. ETA 9 days. Hold on. The sender identification listed a species I had to look up in our own archives. Humans, Terran Confederation. Category 4. Mid-tier galactic newcomers. Territorial range concentrated in the Orion Spur. Our records on them were thin. A young species, barely 3 centuries into interstellar travel. Known for rapid expansion, cultural fragmentation, and an unusual tendency toward intervention in conflicts that did not involve them. No formal diplomatic relationship with the Velhari. No trade agreements. No mutual defense pacts. No reason whatsoever to respond to our distress call, let alone dispatch a fleet. I read the message again, then a third time. The language was so direct, so stripped of diplomatic cushioning, that I genuinely believed it might be a translation error. Fleet is already en route. Not we are considering your request. Not we will review the feasibility. The fleet was already moving. They had read our distress call and started flying before they even told us they were coming. I brought the message to the council chamber. The reaction was exactly what I expected. Councillor Vetha Soren read it with her luminescence flickering in a pattern I had never seen before. Something between hope and suspicion. Councillor Dareth Moan immediately asked the question that every Velhari was thinking, the question that our entire history had trained us to ask whenever a more powerful species showed interest in us. What do the humans want from us? It was the right question. In the galaxy as we understood it, nothing came without a price. Aid was leverage. Rescue was debt. The strong helped the weak only when the weak had something the strong wanted, and the Velhari had nothing. No strategic territory, no rare minerals, no military value, no trade leverage. We were a small, soft, glowing species on a dying world at the edge of mapped space. We had absolutely nothing to offer, and that made the human message either the most generous act in galactic history or the most suspicious. I did not know which one. But as I stood in that council chamber, watching my people argue about the intentions of a species we had never met, I realized something that settled into my bones like cold water. In 7 weeks of dying, 40 galactic powers had found reasons to refuse us. And a species on the other side of the spiral arm, a species we had never spoken to, had not even waited to be asked twice. 9 days. They told us to hold on. I did not know yet whether the humans would save us, but I knew this much. They were the only ones who had tried. The 9 days that followed were the longest of my life, and I say that as someone whose species was already counting down the months to extinction. The council debated endlessly. Were the humans sincere? Was this a ploy? Were we walking into a trap more subtle than anything the Dralith or Korvathi had ever designed? Counselor Dareth Moan spent 3 full days researching human history in our archives and came back with a report that only deepened the confusion. Humans had a documented pattern of intervening in crises involving species they had no formal relationship with, sometimes at enormous cost to themselves. They had also fought some of the most devastating internal wars in recorded galactic history. They were, by every metric Dareth could find, deeply contradictory, capable of extraordinary compassion and extraordinary violence, sometimes in the same generation. The council wanted me to prepare a diplomatic reception, formal protocols, ceremonial lighting arrays, a carefully structured first contact sequence that would allow us to assess human intentions before granting access to our population centers. I prepared all of it, because that is what a chronicler does. None of it mattered. On the 9th day, the humans arrived, and they did not wait for a ceremony. I was standing on the observation terrace when their ships broke through the upper atmosphere, and the first thing I thought was that someone had made a terrible mistake. These were not the gleaming warships I had seen in galactic fleet registries. This was a convoy that looked like it had been assembled by someone raiding a salvage yard during a fire, cargo haulers with mismatched hull plating, medical frigates trailing exhaust from engines that sounded like they were arguing with themselves, engineering barges so loaded with equipment that they listed visibly to one side during descent, and leading the formation, a decommissioned military transport that had been converted into what I would later learn was a mobile field hospital. Its original weapon mounts replaced with atmospheric sensor arrays that stuck out at odd angles, like the quills of a startled animal. They were not elegant. They were not impressive. They looked like exactly what they were, a group of people who had heard someone was dying and grabbed everything they could carry before running out the door. They landed in the agricultural flats outside the capital, and I watched from the terrace as the cargo doors opened and humans poured out. My first impression was overwhelming. Humans are enormous compared to the Velhari. Even their shortest adults towered over our tallest elders. They moved with a kind of organized chaos that was completely alien to our culture, shouting to each other across the landing field, waving arms, pointing in multiple directions at once. Within minutes of landing, before any diplomatic contact had been established, they were already unloading crates. Water purification units, atmospheric scrubbers, medical supplies in containers, marked with symbols I did not recognize, food stores, construction materials, portable power generators. Nobody had told them to start. Nobody had given them permission. They simply landed and began working, as if the concept of waiting for bureaucratic approval while people were dying was physically offensive to them. I descended from the terrace and walked toward the landing field, my formal diplomatic remarks rehearsed and ready. I never delivered them. A human spotted me approaching, broke into a grin that showed an alarming number of teeth, and called out something to a colleague behind her. Within seconds, I was surrounded by humans who were asking me questions in rapid succession, most of them practical. Where were the primary water treatment facilities? What was the current atmospheric composition at ground level? Were there population centers downwind of the filtration membrane failure zone? Did the Velhari have any known adverse reactions to iron-based water purification compounds? I answered as quickly as I could, but the pace of their questions was relentless. They did not wait for one answer before asking the next. A young human man with dark skin and kind eyes knelt down to my height, which I would later learn was a gesture of respect in human culture, and asked me very gently if there were children who were already sick. When I told him yes, his expression changed in a way I had never seen on an alien face before. It was not pity. It was not the practiced concern of the Concord Assembly liaison. It was anger, pure, clean, directed anger at the situation itself, as if the fact that Velhari children were suffering was a personal offense against everything he believed. I was escorted through the organized chaos to the command ship, where I met the woman in charge. Commander Dakarai Osei was not what I expected. She was shorter than most of the humans around her, stocky, with close-cropped gray hair and a scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw. She wore a uniform that had been mended so many times it was more patch than original fabric. She looked at me with steady brown eyes and extended a hand, which I had read was a human greeting ritual involving physical contact. I placed my much smaller hand in hers, and she closed her fingers around it, with a gentleness that surprised me. I delivered the question the entire Velhari species needed answered. Commander Osier, on behalf of the Velhari Council, I must ask what terms you require for your assistance. What do the humans want from us? She stared at me for a long moment. Then her brow furrowed, and I saw something cross her face that I could only describe as confused offense, as if I had asked her something so fundamentally wrong that she needed a moment to process that the question had actually been spoken aloud. You sent a distress call, she said. We were close enough to help. That is it. I pressed further. There must be conditions, trade agreements, resource concessions, strategic basing rights, some form of reciprocal obligation. I listed every transactional framework I had ever encountered in galactic diplomacy, because one of them had to be the answer. No species crossed the galaxy to help strangers for free. That was not how the universe worked. Osea let me finish. Then she said something that I have carried with me every day since, something I inscribed into the chronicle in my own hand, because I wanted the exact words preserved. You are dying. We have ships. What kind of people would we be if we did not come? I did not have an answer. In my entire career as a diplomatic historian, across thousands of pages of interspecies treaties and negotiations and carefully balanced exchanges of value for value, I had never encountered that question. Not once. Because no species had ever thought to ask it. The humans did not wait for me to respond. They were already working. Atmospheric remediation stations were being assembled from prefabricated components, fitted with modifications that their engineers had apparently designed during the flight over, using nothing but our outdated technical specifications, pulled from a galactic archive that no other species had ever bothered to open. A human engineer, a cheerful woman named Sophie Adler who talked constantly while she worked, told me she had spent the entire 9-day journey reverse engineering our atmospheric filtration biochemistry from a research paper that a Velhari scientist had published 40 years ago and that had received exactly 0 citations. We pulled it from a dead corner of the academic database, Sophie said, tightening a bolt on a scrubber unit that she had modified with parts clearly scavenged from 3 different machines. Nobody had read it, nobody cared, but it was brilliant work, and it gave us everything we needed to start designing remediation catalysts compatible with your membrane biology. A Velhari paper, read by humans, ignored by everyone else. Medical teams set up field hospitals adapted on the fly for Velhari physiology, which they knew almost nothing about. I watched a human doctor named Liam Ashworth spend 2 hours studying a Velhari anatomical chart, asking one of our physicians detailed questions about our circulatory system, our bioluminescent neural pathways, our respiratory chemistry. He made mistakes. He asked questions that any Velhari medical student could have answered. But he was learning, rapidly and without embarrassment, and by the end of the day he had recalibrated his diagnostic equipment to register Velhari vital signs with an accuracy that impressed even our own doctors. They were not graceful. They were not efficient, at least not at first. They were loud and chaotic, and they broke things and fixed them and broke them again. But they were there. They were physically, stubbornly, impossibly there. That evening, word of the human arrival spread across Shurith Prime. For the first time in weeks, the communication channels were full of something other than despair. Velhari from distant settlements were asking questions, wanting confirmation. Was it true? Had someone actually come? Were they really helping? In the council chamber, the mood was cautiously hopeful, but deeply uncertain. Councillor Dareth Moan had intercepted a transmission from a Draelith diplomatic vessel that had passed through our system, scanned the human operation, and sent a brief assessment to the Concord Assembly. Humans wasting resources on a non-viable species. Recommend no further attention. Non-viable species. That was the galaxy's final assessment of 900 million Velhari lives. I felt the familiar shame that every Velhari learns to carry from childhood, the quiet knowledge that the galaxy considers you insignificant. But this time, underneath the shame, I felt something new, anger. Clean, bright, Unfamiliar anger. Not at the Draelith specifically, but at the entire framework that made their assessment possible. A framework where the worth of a species was measured in military tonnage and mineral deposits and strategic positioning, and anything that fell below the threshold was classified as non-viable and left to die. The humans did not use that framework. I was beginning to understand that they did not even recognize it. Late that night, long after the council session ended and the capital had gone quiet, I walked through the human camp. I told myself I was conducting a routine observation for the Chronicle, but the truth was simpler than that. I needed to see them. I needed to confirm that they were real. The camp was not quiet. Humans, I was learning, are rarely quiet. But the noise had shifted from the frantic energy of the day to something softer. Low conversations, occasional laughter, the sound of tools being cleaned and stored. I moved through the rows of temporary shelters, my bioluminescence dim so as not to disturb anyone, and I saw the things that formal diplomacy never shows you. A human engineer, asleep sitting upright against a crate, a half-eaten meal, balanced on one knee. Two technicians arguing in whispers about the best way to recalibrate a sensor array, drawing diagrams in the dirt with their fingers. A cook preparing food in enormous quantities, humming to herself as she worked. And then I saw something that broke me open. In the medical tent at the far edge of the camp, a human medic was sitting on the ground beside a Velhari child. The child was one of the first to fall ill from the atmospheric contamination, a small girl from the outer settlements whose parents had carried her to the capital on foot when the transport networks failed. She was too weak to move, her bioluminescence barely flickering, her breathing shallow and labored. The medic, a young woman named Grace Elliott, had finished her shift hours ago. I later learned she had worked 16 consecutive hours treating patients. She was exhausted. She should have been sleeping. Instead, she was sitting on the bare ground beside a child she could not communicate with, from a species she had learned about 9 days ago. And she was holding the child's tiny glowing hand in both of her own. She was humming, a melody I did not recognize, something simple and slow, a human lullaby perhaps. Nobody had told her to do this. There was no protocol for it, no strategic value, no diplomatic calculation. She was simply a person who saw a frightened child and decided that the child should not be alone. I stood in the entrance of that tent for a long time, watching. My luminescence flared without my permission, bright ripples of color cascading across my skin in patterns that I could not control. Patterns that in Velhari culture signify a grief so profound it turns into something else entirely. Something that has no word in any galactic language I know, but that I will try to translate here, for the Chronicle, because it matters. It is the feeling of being seen for the first time, not assessed, not evaluated, not measured against an index of usefulness, seen as a living thing that matters simply because it is alive. I left the tent quietly and walked back to the archive alone. I sat at my chronicler's desk, and I opened a new page, and I wrote a single line that I underlined twice. I do not know what kind of species the humans are, but I know this. They are the kind that comes when you call. I did not understand them yet. I did not understand why they had come, or what drove them, or how a species that young and that chaotic could produce people like Grace Elliott and Dakarai Ose. But I understood, with a certainty that settled into my bones and would never leave, that the galaxy's measurement of worth was broken. It had always been broken, and the humans were the proof. The first 3 months changed everything I thought I knew about how species interact with each other. I had spent my entire career studying diplomacy, the careful architecture of mutual obligation that holds galactic civilization together, trade for trade, favor for favor, every interaction balanced on a ledger, every gesture calibrated to maximize return. The humans operated on a different system entirely, and it took me weeks to understand what that system was, because it was so foreign to everything I had been taught that my mind kept trying to translate it into frameworks I already knew. They just helped, that was the system. They saw a problem and they tried to fix it. Not because fixing it advanced their strategic position or generated economic return, but because the problem existed and they had the ability to address it. It was maddening in its simplicity. Commander Ose established her operational headquarters in the agricultural district outside the capital, close to the worst areas of atmospheric degradation. I spent most of my days there, serving as the unofficial liaison between the Velhari Council and the Human Relief Operation. The Council wanted formal reports, structured briefings, detailed accounts of human activities that could be analyzed for hidden motives. I provided all of this, but the truth was that the humans were remarkably bad at having hidden motives. Everything they did was visible, discussed openly, and explained in detail to anyone who asked. The atmospheric remediation was the priority. Sophie Adler and her engineering team had deployed a network of catalytic scrubbers across the most damaged zones, each one customized using the biochemical data from that 40-year-old Velhari research paper that nobody in the galaxy had bothered to read. The scrubbers were working, slowly breaking down the toxic compounds that the stellar flare had generated and feeding repair nutrients into the degraded filtration membrane. But the damage was deep, deeper than the initial scans had shown. The membrane was not just damaged on the surface. Its root structure, the biological network that anchored it to the upper atmosphere, had been partially severed. Sophie told me one evening, with the kind of blunt honesty I was learning to expect from humans, that they had slowed the collapse, but were nowhere close to reversing it. "We are buying you time," she said, wiping grease from her hands with a cloth that was already more grease than cloth. "But time is not a solution. Time is just the space where you find a solution, if you are lucky." I appreciated her honesty. The Velhari had spent centuries being lied to by species who told them what they wanted to hear while doing nothing. Sophie told me the truth, and then went back to work, which I found infinitely more respectful. The medical operation was equally intense. Liam Ashworth had assembled a team of 12 human doctors and 36 medical technicians, all of whom had volunteered for the mission. None of them had ever treated a Velhari patient before arriving on Shurith Prime. They learned on the ground, making mistakes that they caught and corrected with a speed that amazed our own physicians. Within 2 weeks, they had developed treatment protocols for the 3 most common forms of atmospheric contamination sickness affecting Velhari children. Within a month, they had reduced the child mortality rate in the capital district by 60%. But it was the small things that taught me the most about humans. They named everything. The atmospheric scrubbers each had individual names. Sophie called her favorite unit Old Reliable, despite the fact that it broke down twice a week and had to be repaired with increasingly creative combinations of spare parts. The medical tents had names. The mess hall had a name. A particularly large rock that blocked the path between the command center and the water treatment station was named Gerald by a human engineer who had stubbed his toe on it 3 times, and after the 3rd incident, a small hand-painted sign appeared next to the rock that read, "Gerald the Immovable, please go around." This baffled the Velhari. We name things that matter: landmarks, people, historical events. The idea of naming a rock because it had inconvenienced someone was completely outside our cultural framework. But the more I watched, the more I understood. Humans name things because naming creates connection. Gerald the Rock was no longer an obstacle. He was a character in the story of the camp, a shared joke that every human understood and smiled about. The naming was not frivolous. It was how humans built community in hostile environments. They turned the unfamiliar into the personal, and the personal into the shared, and the shared into the endured. I began to notice other things. Humans communicated emotional states through an incredibly complex system of facial expressions, vocal tones, body positions, and timing. The Velhari communicate emotion through bioluminescent color shifts, which is visible and precise and leaves almost no room for ambiguity. Human emotional communication was the opposite. It was layered, contradictory, and required constant active interpretation. A human could say the words, "I am fine," while communicating through every other channel that they were absolutely not fine, and other humans would somehow read both messages simultaneously and respond to the real one rather than the spoken one. What astonished me was how quickly the humans learned to read Velhari bioluminescence. They had no biological capacity for it. They could not produce light from their skin. They had no instinctive framework for interpreting color-based emotional communication. But within weeks, several members of the human team had developed a working fluency in our basic emotional spectrum. They watched us. They paid attention to which colors accompanied which behaviors. They asked questions, genuinely curious questions, not the clinical interrogations of researchers, but the engaged inquiries of people who wanted to understand the individuals they were working beside. Liam Ashworth was particularly remarkable in this regard. He developed a habit of checking the bioluminescent patterns of his Velhari patients before checking their vital signs, because he had noticed that the light patterns often revealed distress before the medical instruments did. He was reading our emotions through a system he had not evolved to understand, using nothing but observation and empathy. When I told him this was extraordinary, he looked confused and said that humans did the same thing with each other all the time. Which was when I realized that the ability to read strangers was not a special human skill, it was their baseline. They saw us, not as a Category 9 species on a galactic index, not as a cost-benefit calculation. They saw us as people, and that seeing required no technology, no biological adaptation, no diplomatic protocol. It required only the decision to pay attention. But the galaxy had not decided to pay attention, and that was about to become a problem. Word of the human operation on Shurith Prime had spread through the galactic communication networks during the first month. The reactions ranged from bemusement to contempt. The Mithrani Observer Corps published an analysis calling the human intervention a case study in emotional resource allocation, meaning they thought the humans were wasting supplies on sentiment rather than strategy. The Draelith hegemony officially logged the Shurith system as a human zone of interest, which sounded neutral, but was actually the Draelith equivalent of marking territory for future review. Several minor species sent private messages to the Velhari Council, asking, with varying degrees of subtlety, what the humans were getting out of the arrangement. I collected all of these communications for the Chronicle. They formed a pattern I had seen before, a pattern that every minor species in the galaxy knew by heart. The powerful do not help the powerless for free. If someone is helping you, they want something. If you cannot figure out what they want, you should be more afraid, not less. I understood the logic. I had grown up inside it. But 3 months of working beside humans had begun to crack something open inside me, a suspicion that the logic might be wrong. Not incomplete, wrong. A fundamental misreading of what was possible between thinking beings. Then the second stellar flare hit, and the logic did not matter anymore. Only survival mattered. It happened on a clear morning. I was in the council chamber reviewing atmospheric data with Councillor Vaitha Soren when the sensors screamed. The stellar monitoring network detected a coronal mass ejection from our sun, far more powerful than the first one, aimed directly at Shurith Prime. We had 90 minutes before it hit. 90 minutes to prepare for a blast of radiation that would undo weeks of atmospheric remediation work in seconds. The humans moved faster than I thought was physically possible. Commander Osei issued orders that turned the entire camp into a synchronized machine. Engineers rushed to shield the most critical scrubber units. Medical teams began evacuating vulnerable patients to hardened shelters. Sophie Adler sprinted across the camp with a toolkit in each hand, shouting instructions to her team, while simultaneously calculating shield harmonics in her head. I watched a species that had seemed chaotic and disorganized snap into a precision operation that would have impressed a Draelith military commander. The flare hit. Even underground I could feel it. The radiation burst slammed into the upper atmosphere like a fist, and through the monitoring systems, I watched the atmospheric filtration membrane shudder and tear. Weeks of careful repair, painstaking catalytic rebuilding, delicate nurturing of damaged biological networks, all of it ripped apart in 11 seconds. The damage reports came in over the next 2 hours, and each one was worse than the last. 30% of the remediation work had been undone. Several atmospheric scrubber units had been destroyed outright, their components fused by the radiation. 2 human engineers had been caught outside the shielded zone when the flare hit, and were being treated for acute radiation exposure. One of the cargo ships, a vessel named the Dunnigan, that had been carrying replacement parts for the water purification system, had taken a direct electromagnetic surge that fried its navigation systems and left it permanently grounded. I found Sophie Adler sitting on the ground outside the engineering bay, staring at the atmospheric data on a handheld display. Her face was streaked with sweat and grime, and her expression was one I had learned to recognize over 3 months of working with humans. It was the expression of someone doing math that did not add up. "How bad?" I asked. She did not look at me. "Bad," she said. "We just lost a month of work. Maybe 6 weeks. And the Dunnigan is finished, which means we are down to half our spare parts inventory." That evening, Commander Osei received a transmission from Earth. I was not present for the communication, but Osei told me about it afterward, sitting in her quarters with a cup of the dark, bitter drink that humans seem to require for survival. Earth Command had reviewed the situation on Shurith Prime in light of the second flare and the loss of the Dunnigan. Their official recommendation was to begin withdrawal of human personnel and equipment. The operation had been classified as unsustainable, the risks disproportionate to the strategic value of the engagement. I felt the ground shift under me when she told me this. This was the moment. Every Velhari alive knew this moment. It was the moment the help stopped, the moment the calculations were run, and the numbers came back negative, and the ships turned around and flew home. It had happened to us before, in smaller ways. Aid programs that evaporated when funding dried up, trade agreements that dissolved when our markets proved too small, promises that melted like frost in daylight because we were not valuable enough to keep. I braced myself. I had already begun composing the chronicle entry in my head. The humans came, they tried, they left. The same story as always, told with different faces. Osei took a long drink from her cup. Then she told me what she had done. She had refused the recommendation. Not dramatically, not with a speech or a declaration. She had simply responded to Earth Command with a revised operational plan. New resource allocation timelines, modified atmospheric targets, an adjusted risk assessment that accounted for the second flare, and at the bottom, instead of an evacuation schedule, a request for additional supplies. I stared at her. She had disobeyed her own government, or rather, she had treated their recommendation as exactly that, a recommendation, and had responded with a plan to stay. I asked her why. "We did not come here to leave when it got hard," she said. "That is the whole point." She told me she had put the question to her crew before responding. Every human on Shorith Prime, from the engineers to the medics to the cook who prepared their meals, had been given a choice: stay or go. The vote was unanimous. They stayed. But it went further than that. Word of the second flare had reached Earth through the news networks, and the response from the human civilian population had been immediate. Independent supply drives were being organized in 12 cities. A university in a place called Edinburgh had dispatched a specialized research team focused on atmospheric reconstruction, funded entirely by private donations from individuals who had never met a Velhari and never would. A retired cargo pilot named Henry Calder had pulled his personal ship out of storage and was currently loading it with water purification supplies purchased with his own savings. These people owed us nothing. They had no connection to us, no obligation, no strategic reason to care, but they had heard that a species was dying on the other side of the galaxy, and they could not sit still. It was not rational. It was not strategic. It was something else entirely, something that I had no framework to explain, and I was the foremost diplomatic historian of my species. 3 weeks later, the Edinburgh team arrived. They were led by a woman named Nora Brennan, a climate reconstruction specialist who had spent her career repairing damaged ecosystems on human colony worlds. She was quiet and precise, the opposite of Sophie Adler's cheerful chaos, and she took one look at the atmospheric data and said something that I will never forget. "Your membrane is not dead, it is dormant. The root structure is still intact beneath the damage layer. We do not need to rebuild it. We need to wake it up." That single insight changed everything. Nora's team identified a catalytic process that could stimulate the dormant root network into active growth, essentially triggering the membrane's own biological repair mechanisms. It would take months to show results, but the projections were transformative. For the first time since the crisis began, the models showed Shurith Prime surviving. But before the celebration could begin, the Korvathi arrived. The Korvathi trade union had been monitoring the Shurith system with increasing interest ever since the humans began their remediation work. A dying world has no value. A world being saved has potential value, and the Korvathi had built their entire civilization on the principle of extracting value from potential. Their trade delegation arrived on a sleek vessel that made the human fleet look like children's toys. 3 Korvathi negotiators, tall and angular with calculating eyes and perfect diplomatic smiles, requested a formal meeting with the Velhari Council. They came bearing gifts, medical supplies, food concentrates, a small atmospheric processing unit that they presented with great ceremony. Then they presented their offer, a comprehensive partnership agreement that would grant the Korvathi Trade Union exclusive resource extraction rights to Shurith Prime's subsurface mineral deposits, which our geological surveys had always classified as minimal, but which the Korvathi seemed to believe were more extensive than we knew. In exchange, the Korvathi would provide ongoing atmospheric maintenance support, infrastructure development, and economic integration into the Korvathi trade network. The contract was 400 pages long. I read every word. Buried in the technical language and diplomatic pleasantries was a framework that would have effectively made the Velhari a client species of the Korvathi Union, surrendering territorial sovereignty in exchange for survival. It was not aid. It was acquisition, dressed in the language of partnership. The Velhari Council was divided. Some members, exhausted by months of crisis and desperate for any guarantee of survival, wanted to sign. Councillor Dareth Moan argued that the Korvathi terms, however unfavorable, were at least concrete. The humans had made no formal commitment to long-term support. What if they left? What if their government ordered them home? What if the next stellar flare destroyed everything again, and this time the humans decided the cost was too high? At least the Korvathi were offering a contract. I understood his argument. Fear makes bad contracts look like good deals. Commander Ose attended the council session as an observer. She did not speak until Councillor Vetha Soren asked for her assessment of the Korvathi offer. Ose stood, looked at the Korvathi delegation with an expression of absolute neutrality, and delivered her assessment in 6 sentences. The Velhari are under no obligation to sign anything while in a state of crisis. Consent given under existential duress is not consent. Your people did not answer the Velhari distress call. You did not come when they were dying. You came when someone else made their survival profitable. I would recommend the council take as much time as they need to evaluate this offer without pressure. The Korvathi lead negotiator, a smooth-voiced individual named Toreth Saholm, smiled and suggested that Commander Ose was overstepping her role as a humanitarian aid provider by offering geopolitical commentary. Ose smiled back, which I had learned was a human expression that did not always indicate friendliness, and informed Toreth that any pressure applied to a distressed species during an ongoing humanitarian crisis would be documented in detail and transmitted to every galactic news network she could reach. The Korvathi delegation left the next morning. They did not take their gifts with them, which the humans quietly repurposed into the remediation effort. That night, I found Ose alone on the observation terrace, staring at the atmospheric data projections that Nora Brennan's team had generated. The numbers were hopeful but fragile. Everything depended on the catalytic process working, on no more flares hitting, on 1,000 variables aligning in the right direction. For the first time, I saw fear on a human face. Not the quick, reactive fear of a sudden threat, but the deep, sustained fear of someone carrying responsibility for lives they might not be able to save. She did not see me at first. She was leaning against the terrace railing, her shoulders tight, her jaw clenched, reading the same data column over and over, as if repetition might change the numbers. I walked to her side and stood there in silence. Among the Velhari, there is a gesture of profound solidarity that has no equivalent in any other culture I have studied. We dim our bioluminescence to match the darkness around us, surrendering our light so that the person beside us does not feel alone in theirs. I had never performed this gesture for a non-Velhari. I was not sure it would translate. I dimmed my light until I was as dark as the terrace around us, until Osi and I were both standing in the same shadow. She noticed. She turned to look at me, and in the faint starlight, I could see that her eyes were wet. "We will figure it out," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "We always figure it out." I did not know if that was true. I did not know if human stubbornness was strong enough to rebuild a sky. But standing there in the dark beside Dakarai Ose, I realized something that no diplomatic framework had ever taught me. Hope is not a calculation. It is not a projection. It is one person refusing to leave and another person choosing to stand beside them. I stayed on the terrace until the stars came out. Osei stayed too. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us needed to. In the Chronicle, I recorded that night as the moment I stopped measuring human value by galactic standards and started measuring galactic standards by human ones. The standards failed. 7 months after the humans first arrived on Shurith Prime, the atmospheric membrane showed its first signs of active self-repair. Nora Brennan's catalytic process was working. The dormant root network was waking up, sending new filaments through the upper atmosphere, weaving fresh filtration tissue to replace what the flares had destroyed. It was slow, it was fragile, but it was happening. And for the first time since the crisis began, the atmospheric projections showed Shurith Prime reaching sustainable recovery within 2 years. I was in the Great Archive updating the Chronicle when the defense alert sounded. The Archive is the oldest structure on Shurith Prime, a vast underground complex where the Velhari have stored our accumulated knowledge for 8,000 years. I had been there since dawn, working on the section of the Chronicle that covered the atmospheric breakthrough. When the alert tone echoed through the stone corridors, I did not recognize it immediately. We had never used it during my lifetime. The last time the Velhari defense alert had been activated was 400 years ago, during a minor territorial dispute with the Sethrani that was resolved through arbitration. I reached the council chamber at a run. The room was already full, every council member present, every screen active. Commander Osi was there, standing behind Councillor Vetha Soren, with her arms crossed and her expression carved from stone. I pushed through the crowd to the main display and saw what had triggered the alert. 3 ships had entered the Soreth system, not cargo haulers, not medical frigates. Drelith heavy cruisers, each one nearly a kilometer long, bristling with weapons arrays that our sensors could barely catalog. The Drelith hegemony had sent a battle group to our doorstep, and they were decelerating toward our orbital space, with the unhurried precision of predators who knew their prey could not run. The communication came through before anyone on our side could formulate a hail. The Drelith did not ask permission to speak. They simply broadcast. The message was a formal territorial claim. The Drelith invoked Provision 18 of the Galactic Territorial Statutes, a regulation so obscure that I had to search the archive database to find the original text. The provision stated that any system inhabited by a species that fails to maintain independent atmospheric viability for one standard galactic cycle, approximately 10 of our months, may be reclassified as an unclaimed territory and open to sovereign annexation by any species with the military capacity to enforce the claim. The Velhari had triggered the provision 4 months ago. Our atmosphere had been non-viable for longer than one galactic cycle. The Drelith had known this the entire time. They had watched us dying and done nothing, watched the humans fighting to save us and done nothing. And now, precisely at the moment when our world was beginning to recover, they had arrived to take it. The council chamber erupted. Councillor Dareth Moan was shouting that we should surrender immediately, that resistance against 3 Drelith heavy cruisers was suicide, that the mathematics of survival demanded capitulation. Councillor Vetha Soren was trying to organize an emergency appeal to the Concord Assembly, though everyone in the room knew the Assembly would side with the Drelith because the Assembly always sided with power. Other council members were arguing, pleading, panicking, their bioluminescence flashing in wild, dissonant patterns of fear that made the chamber walls dance with chaotic light. I stood in the center of it and felt the oldest weight in the galaxy settle onto my shoulders. This was the story of every small species that had ever existed. You survived the disaster only to be consumed by the vultures who were circling overhead while you bled. The Drelith had not cared about Shurith Prime when it was dying. They cared about it now because humans had made it worth caring about. Our world was being stolen not despite the fact that it had been saved, but because it had been saved. I looked at Commander Osei. Her expression had not changed since I entered the room. Her arms were still crossed, her jaw still set, her eyes still reading the tactical display with a focus that excluded everything else. I had learned to read human body language well enough over 7 months to recognize what I was seeing. She was not panicking, she was not calculating odds. She was making a decision that she had already made a long time ago, possibly before she ever left Earth. She turned to me, and said 4 words. Get your council quiet. I did. It took me several minutes and required me to invoke Chronicler's Privilege, an ancient Velhari authority that compels silence in the council chamber during moments of historical significance. When the room was quiet, Osei stepped forward and addressed the council directly. I need to use your communication array, she said. Open channel. Full broadcast range. Every frequency. Councillor Vetha Soran authorized it without hesitation. I think she already knew what Osei was going to do. I think, on some level, all of us did. Commander Osei stood at the communication podium and broadcast on every open channel in the sector. Her voice was calm, controlled, absolutely steady. This is Commander Dakarai Osei, Terran Confederation Humanitarian Fleet, operating under mandate from the Office of Interstellar Aid. The Velhari people of Shurith Prime are under our protection. This system is inhabited by a sovereign species, currently receiving humanitarian assistance under interstellar convention. Any attempt to annex, occupy, or coerce the inhabitants of this system will be treated as an act of aggression against Earth and all affiliated human territories. We will not withdraw. We will not negotiate under duress. This is not a request. This is a statement of position. Then she walked out of the council chamber and went to her ship. I followed her because I could not do anything else. My legs moved on their own, carrying me through the corridors and out onto the landing field where the human fleet sat in its ragged, patched, improbable formation. Cargo haulers, medical frigates, engineering barges, not a single warship among them, not a single vessel designed for combat. Osei boarded her command ship, the same converted troop transport that had led the fleet into our atmosphere 7 months ago, and she moved it. She moved all of them. Every human ship in the Shurith system lifted off and repositioned, forming a loose line directly between the 3 Draelith heavy cruisers and Shurith Prime. I stood on the observation terrace and watched a fleet of relief ships place themselves in the path of 3 warships, each one carrying enough firepower to reduce them to scattered atoms. The humans had no weapons. They had no shields worth mentioning. They had water purifiers and atmospheric scrubbers and medical equipment, and a rock named Gerald, and they put themselves between us and the largest military force in the sector. The Draelith response was immediate. Their fleet commander broadcast a direct communication to Osei, which our sensors intercepted. He was incredulous, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone encountering a form of behavior so far outside their experience that they cannot determine whether it is brave or insane. Commander Osei, you are outnumbered and outgunned by a factor I find embarrassing to calculate. Your fleet has no combat capability. Withdraw immediately, and this will be recorded as a misunderstanding. Osei's response was brief. We are aware of the tactical situation. Our position is unchanged. The Draelith commander tried again, this time with more force. You are risking an incident that could escalate to interstellar conflict. Over what? A Category 9 species that contributes nothing to galactic civilization? You would start a war for this? Osei did not answer for several seconds. When she spoke, her voice carried the same calm she had used in her broadcast. But underneath it, I heard something harder, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, assuming I had hairs, which I do not, but the human expression captures the feeling precisely. You measured their worth and found them lacking, Osei said. We measured your character and found the same. Our position is unchanged. You may fire when ready. The channel went silent. The standoff lasted 11 days. I know because I counted every hour, recording each one in the chronicle with a precision born of terror. 3 Draelith heavy cruisers facing a line of unarmed humanitarian vessels, and the entire galaxy watching. Osei had been clever, devastatingly clever. By broadcasting on open channels, she had ensured that every species in the sector knew what was happening. The Draelith could destroy the human fleet in minutes, but they could not do it quietly. And Osei had calculated, correctly, that the Draelith valued their reputation as a legitimate galactic power more than they valued the Shurith system. Destroying an unarmed humanitarian fleet on a live broadcast would not make them look strong. It would make them look monstrous. And monsters, however powerful, have difficulty maintaining trade agreements. Behind the visible standoff, Earth's diplomatic corps worked with a speed and ferocity that I only learned about later. Human ambassadors contacted every species that had trade relationships with the Draelith hegemony and asked a single devastating question. If the Draelith will invoke an obscure annexation clause to seize a dying world from a minor species under humanitarian protection, what is stopping them from doing the same to you? It was brilliant. The Draelith's action was technically legal, but its implications were universal. Every minor and mid-tier species in the galaxy suddenly saw themselves in the Velhari's position. If Provision 18 could be used to annex Shurith Prime, it could be used to annex anyone. The Draelith were not just threatening the Velhari. They were threatening the principle that small species have the right to exist without being consumed by larger ones. The diplomatic pressure built quietly but relentlessly. Trade partners began making cautious inquiries about the stability of their agreements with the Draelith. Two minor species formally requested Concord Assembly review of Provision 18, a Korvathi trade union analysis, leaked to the galactic press by someone who was almost certainly a human intelligence operative, revealed that the Draelith had been systematically identifying vulnerable systems for potential annexation for decades. The Shurith claim was not an isolated incident, it was a policy. On the 11th day, the Draelith heavy cruisers turned and left. The official Draelith statement called it a voluntary deferral of territorial proceedings pending further review. It was face-saving language for a retreat, and everyone in the galaxy knew it. I was in the council chamber when the sensors confirmed the Draelith ships had left the system. The room was silent. Velhari bioluminescence was so bright that the chamber looked like the inside of a star, colors cascading and flowing in patterns that I had never seen in my entire life. Patterns that our children will study for generations because they represented something the Velhari had never collectively expressed before. I went to find Osei. She was on the bridge of her command ship, sitting in the captain's chair with her hands resting on the armrests. The bridge crew was quiet, some of them leaning against their stations, some staring at empty screens, all of them wearing the particular expression of humans who have just survived something they were not sure they would survive. Osei's hands were shaking. I noticed it as I approached, the fine tremor in her fingers, the way she gripped the armrest to keep the shaking hidden. She had been terrified. For 11 days, she had stood between our world and annihilation, with nothing but her voice and her stubbornness, and she had been terrified the entire time. I climbed onto the platform beside her chair, which brought me close to her eye level, and I asked the question that I knew the Chronicle required. Why did you do it? She did not answer immediately. She looked at her shaking hands, then out the viewport at the stars, then at me. Because the whole galaxy was watching, she said. And someone had to show them what the right thing looks like, even when it is expensive. My bioluminescence flared. I could not control it. Every cell in my body produced light at once, a cascade of radiance that lit up the bridge of that battered, unarmed, impossibly brave ship. In Velhari culture, that involuntary full-body illumination has a name. It is called the Eternal Acknowledgement. It means, I will remember you when the stars go dark. It means you are written into the chronicle of my species so deeply that forgetting you would require forgetting ourselves. Osei watched my light fill her bridge, and I saw tears running down her face, catching the glow, turning her scars into rivers of color. Neither of us spoke. We did not need to. Some things do not require language. They require only presence, and light, and the stubborn refusal to look away from each other in a galaxy that had been looking away from the Velhari for as long as we had existed. I recorded the 11-day standoff in the Chronicle that night. I titled the section with a single Velhari phrase that translates roughly as, "The ones who did not move." It was the most important thing I had ever written, and I knew, even then, that the story was not over. 15 years. That is how long it has been since a ragged fleet of human cargo ships broke through the dying atmosphere of Shurith Prime and changed everything. I am writing this from the Great Archive, which is no longer the modest underground complex it was when the crisis began. It is now the largest cross-species historical repository in the galaxy, a sprawling complex of interconnected chambers that extends 3 levels above ground and 7 below, housing not only the complete chronicles of the Velhari people, but the accumulated records of 32 other species who have entrusted their histories to our care. The walls glow with bioluminescent tapestries that tell stories in light, and scholars from across the sector travel here to study our archives. Because it turns out that a species the galaxy once classified as negligible was keeping records that nobody else bothered to maintain. I am older now. My bioluminescence has shifted toward the deeper blues that mark a Velhari in their later years, and my hands are not as steady as they once were when I inscribed the chronicle. But my memory is precise, because that is what I am. I am a chronicler, and the story I have to tell is one that the galaxy is still trying to understand. Shureth Prime survived. That is the simple version. The atmospheric membrane completed its self-repair cycle 3 years after Nora Brennan's team activated the catalytic process, and it came back stronger than before, as if the near-death experience had triggered dormant genetic resilience that our scientists had never documented. The toxic compounds were fully metabolized, the water systems cleared, the crops returned, our children stopped dying. But survival was only the beginning of what happened here. The Velhari who emerged from the crisis were not the same Velhari who entered it. Something fundamental had shifted in our collective understanding of ourselves, and it began with a question that I first heard Counselor Vaitha Soren ask during a late-night session, 6 months after the Draelith withdrew. If the galaxy was wrong about us, she said, her luminescence steady and bright, what else is the galaxy wrong about? It was the most dangerous question a minor species could ask. For centuries, the Velhari had accepted the galaxy's assessment of our value. We were small, we were fragile, we had no military, no strategic resources, no economic leverage. We were Category 9, the bottom of the index, and we had internalized that ranking so completely that it had become part of our identity. We did not matter. Everyone said so. We believed them. The humans taught us to stop believing, not through speeches or philosophy, through action. Through the simple, repeated, daily demonstration that our lives had value, that our survival was worth fighting for, that a species did not need warships or rare minerals to deserve help. Every water filter the humans installed, every sick child Liam Ashworth treated, every atmospheric scrubber Sophie Adler repaired with parts held together by determination and creative profanity, was an argument against the galaxy's classification system. And unlike the galaxy's arguments, the human arguments worked. They kept us alive. Once we stopped accepting the galaxy's definition of our worth, we started discovering our actual worth, and that discovery changed everything. The Velhari have always been archivists. It is our deepest cultural trait, the thing we do better than anyone else in the galaxy. We record, we preserve, we catalog, we track patterns across centuries, and synthesize information from sources that other species discard or forget. For 8,000 years, we had maintained the most comprehensive historical archive of any species in the sector, and nobody had cared. Our records were meticulous, exhaustive, and completely ignored by a galaxy that valued warships over wisdom. But meticulous, exhaustive records, it turns out, are the foundation of something extraordinarily powerful when combined with the right analytical framework. And that framework came from an unlikely collaboration. 3 years after the crisis, a Velhari data analyst named Pethan Oresh was working with a human researcher from the Edinburgh team, a statistician named Claire Dunmore, who had stayed on Shureth Prime after the atmospheric recovery because, as she put it, she had found interesting problems and was not finished with them. Together, they developed a method of deep pattern historical analysis that cross-referenced political, economic, ecological, and social data across multiple species and multiple centuries. They were looking for patterns in civilizational instability, trying to understand why certain systems collapsed and others endured. What they found was extraordinary. The Velhari archives, dismissed by the galaxy as the dusty records of an irrelevant species, contained data that no other source could provide. Because the Velhari had been recording everything for 8,000 years, from trade fluctuations to diplomatic correspondence to ecological measurements, and because we had been doing it with the obsessive precision that only a species with nothing else to offer bothers to maintain, our archives contained the raw material for predictive modeling on a scale that no one had ever attempted. Pethan and Claire's analytical framework could identify early warning signs of political instabilities, economic collapses, and ecological crises with an accuracy that stunned the galactic academic community. They published their first paper to widespread skepticism. They published their second paper with 3 successful predictions already validated. By the 4th paper, every major galactic power was requesting access to the Velhari archives, because the species they had dismissed as negligible was now holding information that could save or destroy economies, prevent or predict wars, and identify ecological catastrophes before they became irreversible. The galaxy had been sitting on the most valuable dataset in existence for 8,000 years, and they had never looked at it because it belonged to a species they considered worthless. I take a particular satisfaction in that irony. The chronicler in me appreciates a narrative with a well-earned reversal. But the transformation of the Velhari was only part of the story. The larger story was the alliance. The Velhari-Human alliance was formalized 5 years after the crisis, not as a military pact, but as something more unusual and, as it turned out, more powerful. It was a mutual support compact. Humans provided security and logistical reach, the physical infrastructure of protection and transport that the Velhari could not generate on our own. The Velhari provided analytical depth, cultural memory, and a diplomatic perspective that no powerful species could replicate. That diplomatic perspective deserves explanation, because it is the thing that the galaxy least expected and least understood. The Velhari spent centuries at the bottom of the galactic hierarchy. We were overlooked, dismissed, ignored, and occasionally exploited. We were present at countless negotiations, summits, and assemblies where our voice carried no weight and our presence was barely acknowledged. And because no one was paying attention to us, we were paying attention to everything. We know how power behaves when it thinks no one is watching. We know what the Dralith discuss in private sessions that they believe are unmonitored. We know which Korvathi trade agreements contain hidden clauses that violate their own published standards. We know which Concord Assembly votes were influenced by backroom pressure, and which representatives changed their positions after undisclosed meetings. We know these things because we were there, standing quietly in the corner, recording everything, and nobody thought to ask us to leave, because nobody thought we mattered enough to be a threat. 8,000 years of being invisible gave the Velhari the most comprehensive understanding of galactic power dynamics that any species has ever possessed. And when we finally had the protection and the platform to use that understanding, it turned out that the overlooked see more clearly than the powerful, because the powerful never learned to look. Commander Ose retired from active service 2 years after the Dralith standoff. She did not go home. She stayed on Shurith Prime, and the Velhari Council offered her a title that had never been given to a non-Velhari in our entire history. Honorary Elder. She accepted with the kind of gruff, embarrassed gratitude that I had learned was the human way of being deeply moved. Osea lives in a small dwelling near the archive now. She tends a garden, which she is spectacularly bad at, and she attends council sessions in an advisory capacity, offering the kind of blunt strategic assessment that the Velhari have come to rely on. Her hair has gone fully white, her scar has faded. She still drinks that terrible dark bitter liquid every morning, and she still refuses to explain why humans find it palatable. Sophie Adler runs the engineering faculty at the new Velhari Human Technical Institute, training a generation of engineers from both species. She named the building after Old Reliable, the atmospheric scrubber that broke down twice a week and was held together with spare parts and stubbornness. There is a plaque in the lobby that reads, "Where there is a problem, there is a solution. You just have not found it yet." Liam Ashworth returned to Earth for several years, but came back to establish a cross-species medical research center that has produced breakthroughs in treating 17 different forms of atmospheric contamination sickness across 9 species. He married a Methrani physician he met at a conference. Their household is reportedly very interesting. Nora Brennan never left. She and Pethan Orish co-direct the Ecological Memory Project, which uses the Velhari analytical framework to identify at-risk biospheres across the sector before they reach crisis point. They have intervened successfully in 4 cases so far, each time reaching a world before the atmosphere failed, each time arriving with the tools and knowledge to help, because someone was paying attention early enough to make a difference. The alliance grew. 7 other species, all previously classified as negligible or non-viable by galactic standards, joined the Velhari Human Compact within the first decade. The Tereshi, a species of deep-sea archivists whose underwater cities had been threatened by industrial pollution from Korvathi mining operations. The Selani, a nomadic species whose migration routes had been disrupted by Dralith territorial expansion. The Verdathi, a silicon-based species whose unique biochemistry had been exploited for industrial applications without consent or compensation. Each one a species that the galaxy had used, ignored, or discarded. Each one carrying knowledge, perspective, and capability that the galaxy had never bothered to discover. The compact became a coalition, not a military bloc, not an economic cartel, something harder to define and harder to counter. A network of the overlooked, bound together by the principle that no species should have to face extinction alone, and that the value of a civilization cannot be measured by its military tonnage. The galaxy's major powers did not know what to do with us. We did not threaten anyone. We did not seek territorial expansion. We did not compete for trade dominance. We simply refused to let any member species die alone, and we pooled our collective knowledge and analytical capability to see problems before they became crises, and to offer help before it was requested. That combination of early warning and proactive aid turned out to be more disruptive to the galactic order than any fleet, because it undermined the fundamental assumption on which galactic power was built. The assumption that the strong define value, and the weak accept the definition. The Concord Assembly was forced to reform its aid protocols after the Shurith Prime incident exposed the hollowness of its mandate. The committee that had asked us to submit supplementary documentation while we were dying was dissolved. A new rapid response framework was established, modeled, though they would not publicly admit it, on the human approach. Several galactic powers began quietly revising their crisis response procedures. The Dralith hegemony's reputation never fully recovered, and 3 of their tributary species renegotiated their agreements under terms that would have been unthinkable before a human commander stood between 3 warships and a dying world, and refused to move. I have recorded all of this, every detail, every name, every moment of transformation. That is my function, and it is my privilege. Today, I am delivering the Quinquennial Chronicle, a Velhari tradition in which the Elder Chronicler addresses the species and records the defining truth of the era for future generations. But this time, I am not speaking only to the Velhari. The broadcast will reach every species in the sector, because the archive now has that reach, and because the truth I have to record is not ours alone. I stand at the podium in the Chronicle Hall, a chamber carved from living stone that has heard the voices of every Elder Chronicler for 3,000 years. The walls are lined with bioluminescent tapestries, each one encoding decades of history and patterns of light. The hall is full, Velhari in person, filling every seat and standing in the corridors beyond. Representatives from the 7 allied species, present in honor. A delegation of humans, including a white-haired woman in the front row, who is trying very hard not to cry. I begin. I tell them that the Velhari were not weak. We were unvalued. And the difference between those 2 things is the difference between a species that cannot survive and a species that was never given the chance. For centuries, we accepted the galaxy's measurement of our worth because we did not know there was another way to measure. We stood on the scales that the powerful had built and accepted the numbers that came back. And when those numbers said we were negligible, we believed it. We built our identity around it. We made our smallness into a fact of nature rather than a consequence of a broken system. I tell them about the 41 distress calls and the 41 species that found reasons to refuse. I tell them about the cost-benefit analyses that proved our lives were not worth the investment, about the committees that asked for supplementary documentation while our children were dying, about the diplomatic liaison who nodded sympathetically and offered nothing. And then I tell them about the humans, not as saviors, because that word implies a hierarchy that the humans themselves would reject. I tell them about the humans as a species that operated on a different definition of value, a definition that did not require strategic returns, or economic calculations, or military assessments. A definition that began and ended with a single question that Commander Dakarai Osei asked me on the first day, standing in the chaos of a landing field surrounded by mismatched ships and improbable hope. What kind of people would we be if we did not come? I tell them that the humans did not save the Velhari because we were valuable. They saved us because they refused to live in a galaxy where a species' right to exist depended on its usefulness to the powerful. And in doing so, they did not just preserve our lives. They unlocked everything we were capable of becoming. The analytical frameworks, the predictive modeling, the diplomatic insight, the 8,000 years of knowledge that the galaxy had sitting right in front of it and never thought to use. All of it was always there. We were always capable of it. We just needed someone to believe we were worth keeping alive long enough to discover it. I tell them that the galaxy has always measured strength in firepower and territory and economic output. And by those measurements, the Velhari are still small. We still have no warships. We still have no rare minerals. We are still a meter tall with translucent skin and gentle temperaments and an inability to throw a punch that would concern anyone. But the galaxy's measurements are wrong. They have always been wrong, and the proof is standing in this hall. The proof is the species who came when we called and stayed when it got hard, and stood between us and annihilation with nothing but their voices and their refusal to move. The proof is the coalition that grew from that refusal, the network of overlooked species who discovered that their combined knowledge and perspective was more powerful than any fleet. Because fleets can be outgunned, but understanding cannot. I pause. The hall is silent. The bioluminescence of every Velhari in the room is synchronized, a collective glow that makes the chamber look like the inside of a star. I say the last thing. The strongest thing in the universe is not a weapon or a warship or a territorial claim. The strongest thing in the universe is the decision to stand beside someone when there is no reason to, except that they need you. The humans taught us that, and we are teaching the galaxy. And someday, when the lesson has finally reached every corner of every sector, the galaxy will look back at this moment and understand that the species they called negligible were the ones who changed everything. I step back from the podium. The Chronicle Hall erupts in light, every Velhari blazing, every bioluminescent tapestry on the walls responding to the collective emotional output and amplifying it until the chamber is so bright that the human delegates have to shield their eyes. All except Osei, who sits in the front row with tears streaming down her face and her eyes wide open, refusing to look away, the same way she refused to move her ships, the same way she refused every recommendation to leave, the same way she has refused, for 15 years, to be anything other than exactly what she is. After the ceremony, the hall empties slowly. Delegates and representatives file out in small groups, talking quietly, processing what they have heard. The allied species representatives gather with their Velhari counterparts for a reception in the archive's upper galleries. The humans cluster together the way humans always do, talking too loudly and laughing at things that are not particularly funny, because that is how humans manage emotion, by converting it into noise and connection. I stay behind. The Chronicle Hall is quiet now, empty except for me and the tapestries and the fading glow of 1,000 synchronized bioluminescent signatures lingering on the walls like afterimages. I walk to the oldest tapestry in the hall. It hangs on the north wall, behind the podium, and it is so ancient that its light has dimmed to a whisper. It was woven before the Velhari achieved spaceflight, before we knew there were other species in the galaxy, before we understood how vast and how indifferent the universe could be. It depicts a single light in a field of darkness, one glow, steady and small, holding its position against an expanse of nothing. Our oldest ancestors wove it to represent endurance, the persistence of a small thing that refuses to go out. I reach into my robe and withdraw a filament of fresh bioluminescent thread, spun from my own cells in the traditional method that chroniclers have used for 3,000 years. I add a single new thread to the tapestry, weaving it beside the ancient light. The new thread is warm and bright, and when it settles into the weave, the old light brightens in response, as if it has been waiting for company. One light alone in the darkness is endurance. Two lights together is something else, something the galaxy is still learning to name. I step back and look at the tapestry. Two glows, one ancient and one new, holding steady side by side. Neither one large, neither one powerful by any measurement that the galaxy respects. But enough. Together, more than enough. I dim the archive lights and let the tapestry glow on its own. Then I sit at my desk, open the chronicle to a fresh page, and begin to write the next chapter. Because the story is not over. The story is never over. That is the other thing the humans taught us. You do not stop writing just because you survived. You keep going. You keep recording. You keep the light on, for the ones who come after, so they know where they came from and what was given so they could be here. A small light, a steady light, in a galaxy that tried to let it go out. Enough.